Chapter 1. The Art of Destruction. Sophia Chen pressed her paint-stained fingers against her temples, staring at the eviction notice that had been taped to her studio door like a death sentence. 30 days. She had 30 days to come up with 3 months' back rent, or lose everything she'd worked for since graduating art school. The converted warehouse space in Brooklyn had been her sanctuary for 2 years. Canvases lined the brick walls. Easels stood like sentinels throughout the room, and the smell of turpentine and acrylic paint had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Now it might all disappear, because she'd been foolish enough to believe that passion could pay bills. This is what happens when you chase dreams instead of dollars, she muttered, crumpling the notice. Her phone buzzed with yet another text from her mother, probably asking when she was going to get a real job and move back to California. Sophia ignored it and turned, back to her latest piece, a swirling abstract in deep blues and violent reds that seemed to capture every frustration she'd felt over the past month. The painting was raw, emotional, unfinished, much like her life. The sound of expensive shoes clicking against concrete echoed through the hallway, followed by voices. Her landlord, probably, bringing potential new tenants to see the space. Sophia's stomach clenched. She wasn't ready to face that reality yet. But the footsteps stopped directly outside her door. "This is the unit," came a gravelly voice she didn't recognize. Previous tenant defaulted on rent. Space is available immediately. Sophia's hand stilled on her paintbrush. They were already showing her studio to someone else? She hadn't even been officially evicted yet. "The lighting is exceptional," another voice said. "This one's smooth and rich like aged whiskey. North-facing windows, high ceilings. It would work perfectly for what I have in mind." Something about that voice made her skin prickle with awareness. There was authority in it, the kind of quiet confidence that came with never having to repeat yourself twice. Before she could think better of it, Sophia yanked open the door. "Excuse me," she said, trying to keep her voice level despite the paint streaked across her vintage band t-shirt and the fact that she probably looked like she'd been living on coffee and determination for days. "I'm still the tenant here." "You can't just..." The words died in her throat. The man standing beside her weaselly landlord, Mr. Kowalski, was devastatingly handsome in that effortless way that suggested expensive genetics and personal trainers. Dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it, sharp jawline, and eyes the color of storm clouds. His charcoal suit probably cost more than her rent, and he wore it like armor. But it was the way he was looking at her, like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve, that made her forget what she'd been about to say. "Miss Chen," Mr. Kowalski said, his tone apologetic but firm. "I tried calling. Since you haven't responded to the eviction notice..." "I just got it today," Sophia snapped, tearing her gaze away from the stranger. "And I told you I'd figure something out." The beautiful man's eyes flicked between her and the notice still clutched in her hand, then past her to the chaos of her studio. She saw him take in the canvases, the scattered brushes, the half-eaten sandwich on her work table next to a cup of what might have once been coffee. "You're an artist," he said. It wasn't a question. "A starving one, apparently," Sophia replied, lifting her chin with what little dignity she had left. "But yes." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "May I see your work?" Mr. Kowalski cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackwood, I don't think..." "5 minutes," the man said, still looking at Sophia. If you don't mind, she should say no, should tell him to come back when she'd been properly evicted, and her dreams had been officially crushed. But there was something in his voice, a note of genuine interest that she hadn't heard from anyone in months. "Fine," she said, stepping aside. "But don't touch anything. Some of the paint is still wet." He moved through her studio like he owned the space, which, given the conversation she'd just overheard, he might soon. But instead of the dismissive glance she expected, he studied each piece with the kind of attention she'd only seen from serious collectors. "These are remarkable," he said, stopping in front of her latest work. "There's so much emotion in them. Pain, but also hope." Sophia's breath caught. Most people looked at her abstract work and saw pretty colors or decorative pieces. This stranger saw the story she'd poured into every brushstroke. "They're just experiments," she said, suddenly self-conscious. I've been trying to capture the feeling of losing something before you've even had a chance to really hold on to it." He turned to look at her then, and she felt exposed under that storm-gray gaze. "And have you? Captured it, I mean." "I thought I had," she said quietly. "Until today," Mr. Kowalski shifted impatiently. "Mr. Blackwood, about the lease terms." "I'll take it," he said without looking away from Sophia. "But I have a condition." Sophia's heart sank. "Of course. Rich, beautiful men always had conditions. The artist stays," he continued. "I want to commission her to create pieces for the space. We'll work out a partnership arrangement." "What?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "You need the studio. I need original art for my new project. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement." His tone was businesslike, but there was something else there. Something that made her pulse quicken. "Unless you have somewhere else to go?" Sophia stared at him, trying to process what had just happened. This stranger, this gorgeous, obviously wealthy stranger, wanted to save her studio? And work with her? "I don't even know your name," she said. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, transforming his face from merely handsome to absolutely devastating. "Adrian Blackwood." The name hit her like a physical blow. Blackwood Industries. Real estate empire, tech investments, more money than some small countries. She'd seen his face on magazine covers, usually with some socialite or model draped on his arm. "You're..." she started, then stopped. What was she supposed to say? "You're the billionaire who's known for collecting beautiful things and discarding them just as easily?" "I'm interested in your work," he said simply. "The question is, are you interested in keeping your studio?" It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. She should grab it without hesitation, be grateful for the rescue. But something in his eyes, that predatory stillness in the way he watched her, made her hesitate. "What kind of partnership?" she asked. "We'll discuss the details over dinner, tomorrow night." "I don't think 8 o'clock. I'll send a car." He pulled out his phone and handed it to her. "Your number." Sophia looked at the device like it might bite her. This was happening too fast. Rich men didn't just sweep in and solve problems without wanting something in return. And men who looked like Adrian Blackwood definitely didn't save struggling artists out of the goodness of their hearts. But the eviction notice was still crumpled in her other hand, and her bank account had exactly $47 in it. She typed in her number and handed the phone back, her fingers brushing his. The contact sent a shock of awareness through her that was anything but professional. "Good," he said, pocketing the device. "We'll discuss the arrangement tomorrow." He started to leave, then paused at the door. "Miss Chen, don't overthink this. Sometimes the most beautiful things come from the most unexpected places." After he left with Mr. Kowalski, Sophia sank onto her paint-splattered stool and stared at the empty doorway. What had just happened? And why did she feel like she just made a deal with the devil himself? Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Looking forward to tomorrow." Sophia's hands trembled as she set the phone down. Adrian Blackwood was dangerous. She could feel it in every fiber of her being. The kind of man who got what he wanted, when he wanted it, regardless of the cost to anyone else. But as she looked around her studio, her sanctuary, her dreams made manifest in paint and canvas, she knew she didn't have a choice. She needed this partnership, even if it meant dancing with the devil. What she didn't realize was that Adrian Blackwood was about to discover that some dances changed you forever. Chapter 2. The Terms of Temptation. Sophia changed clothes 4 times before the car arrived. Nothing in her thrift store wardrobe seemed appropriate for dinner with a billionaire. She finally settled on a simple black dress she'd bought for gallery openings, elegant enough to not embarrass herself, but not so fancy that she'd feel like she was playing dress-up. The sleek black car that pulled up outside her apartment building was worth more than she'd made in the past year. The driver, a kind-faced man who introduced himself as James, treated her like she was already part of Adrian's world. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to give you this," he said, handing her a small wrapped package as they drove through Manhattan. Inside was a phone, expensive, obviously new, with a note written in sharp, confident handwriting, "So we can always reach each other. The number is already programmed." Sophia stared at the device, unease prickling at the back of her neck. She'd agreed to discuss a business partnership, not accept gifts from a man she barely knew. But arguing seemed pointless when she was already in his car, heading to a restaurant she probably couldn't afford to breathe in. The restaurant was exactly what she'd expected, all understated elegance and prices that weren't listed on the menu. Adrian was waiting at a corner table, and when he stood to greet her, Sophia felt that same electric awareness she'd experienced in her studio. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice low enough to send shivers down her spine. "Thank you." She accepted his hand as he helped her into her chair, trying to ignore how perfectly her fingers fit against his palm. "Though I should probably mention that I Googled you," his mouth curved in amusement. "And what did you discover?" "That you're worth more than the GDP of several small nations. That you've never had a relationship last longer than 6 months, and that Forbes called you ruthlessly brilliant in their last profile." She met his eyes steadily. "Should I be concerned?" "That depends," he said, settling back in his chair with predatory grace. "Are you planning to fall in love with me?" The question hit her like a physical blow, unexpected and strangely intimate. "I don't even know you." "Exactly." He signaled the waiter with barely a glance. "So let's discuss business, shall we?" Over the next hour, as they shared food that tasted like poetry and wine that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget, Adrian laid out his proposal. He was developing a high-end residential complex in Brooklyn, luxury condos for wealthy professionals who wanted the authenticity of warehouse living without the inconvenience of actual warehouse problems. He wanted original art pieces for the common areas and model units, pieces that would sell a lifestyle as much as living space. "I need someone who understands the soul of the neighborhood," he explained, his fingers tracing the rim of his wine glass. "Someone whose work captures the raw energy of creation. And you think that's me?" Sophia asked, trying to focus on the business discussion instead of the way his hands moved. "Based on 5 minutes in my studio, I think you have something most artists lose by the time they become successful," he said. "Hunger, desperation, the kind of creative fire that only burns when everything is at stake." His words stung because they were true. "So you want to exploit my financial crisis for authentic art?" "I want to solve your financial crisis while getting exceptional work in return." His tone sharpened slightly. "Don't romanticize struggle, Miss Chen. There's nothing noble about being unable to pay rent." The check arrived, brought discreetly, and whisked away without her ever seeing the total. Another reminder of the vast gulf between their worlds. "The terms," Adrian continued as they prepared to leave, "are generous. 50,000 for 6 large pieces, plus use of your studio space for meetings and presentations. You'll have complete creative control, with the understanding that the work needs to complement the overall aesthetic of the development. $50,000. More money than Sophia had ever seen at once. Enough to pay her back rent, keep her studio, maybe even buy actual groceries instead of living on ramen and hope. "There's a catch," she said. It wasn't a question. "There's always a catch." He helped her with her coat, his hands brushing her shoulders. "I want to watch you work. Understand your process. Be present during the creation." Sophia's breath caught. "You want to what?" "I find the creative process fascinating," he said, his voice casual but his eyes intense. "Especially when it's driven by genuine talent and need. I want to see how you translate emotion into art." They were standing close now, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made her think of dark rooms and tangled sheets. The thought sent heat flooding through her cheeks. "That's intimate," she managed. "Is it?" His smile was dangerous. "I thought it was business." The car ride back to Brooklyn was filled with charged silence. Sophia stared out the window at the city lights, trying to process what she'd agreed to. Adrian Blackwood wanted to watch her work, to be present while she poured her soul onto canvas, vulnerable and exposed in the way that only happened during true creation. It felt like agreeing to let him watch her undress. "Second thoughts?" he asked, his voice cutting through her spiraling thoughts. "Many," she admitted. "But I don't exactly have alternatives. You could go back to California. Get that real job your mother keeps texting you about." Sophia's head snapped toward him. "How do you know about—" She stopped, realization dawning. "You had me investigated." I had you researched, he corrected smoothly. Basic due diligence before entering into any business relationship. Though I must say, your college records were quite impressive. Summa cum laude, full scholarship, professor recommendations that bordered on glowing. Makes me wonder why you're struggling so much now. Because talent doesn't pay bills, she said tightly. And the art world isn't exactly known for supporting unknown artists. But you stayed anyway, even when things got difficult. There was something almost admiring in his voice. Why? Sophia was quiet for a long moment, watching the city blur past. Because some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems hopeless. When the car pulled up outside her building, Adrian got out with her, ignoring her protests that he didn't need to walk her up. I'll have contracts drawn up by tomorrow, he said, as they stood outside her door. And Sophia? The use of her first name sent a shiver through her. Yes? Don't make me regret this. There was something in his tone, a warning maybe, or a promise. Before she could ask what he meant, he was gone, leaving her standing in the hallway with more questions than answers. Inside her apartment, Sophia kicked off her heels and poured herself a glass of cheap wine. She should feel relieved. Her money problems were solved, at least temporarily. Her studio was safe. So why did she feel like she'd just stepped into a trap? Her new phone buzzed with a message. Sleep well. We start Monday. Sophia stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. 3 days to prepare for whatever Adrian Blackwood had planned. 3 days to figure out how to maintain her artistic integrity while working, with a man who seemed to see right through every defense she'd ever built. She had a feeling that $50,000 was going to be the most expensive money she'd ever earned. Chapter 3. The First Stroke. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth, and Sophia's nerves stretched tight as piano wire. She'd spent the weekend researching Adrian's development project, trying to understand what he wanted from her art. The renderings showed sleek, modern spaces with industrial touches, exposed brick, steel beams, floor-to-ceiling windows. Beautiful, but cold. She was mixing colors on her palette when she heard his footsteps in the hallway. Somehow she'd memorized the sound already, confident, measured expensive Italian leather against concrete. Good morning, Adrian said from the doorway, and Sophia's hand jerked, sending a streak of titanium white across her carefully arranged blues. You're early, she said without turning around. She'd dressed carefully this morning in paint-splattered jeans and a fitted t-shirt, armor disguised as work clothes. I'm always early. It's a character flaw. He stepped into the studio, and she could feel his presence like heat at her back. What are you working on? Sophia gestured to the blank canvas on her easel. Your first piece, though I haven't actually started yet. Why not? She finally turned to face him, struck again by how he seemed to command space just by existing. Today he wore dark jeans and a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. Somehow, the casual look made him even more dangerous. Because I don't know what you want, she said honestly. Your buildings are beautiful, but they're impersonal. Safe. My work isn't safe. Adrian moved closer, studying the color palette she'd been mixing. Show me what unsafe looks like. I can't just perform on command, Sophia protested. Art doesn't work that way, doesn't it? He picked up one of her brushes, testing the weight of it in his fingers. You've been creating from desperation for months. Financial pressure, emotional turmoil, the fear of losing everything. That's been your inspiration. His words hit uncomfortably close to home. That's different, is it? Or is it just a different kind of pressure? He set the brush down and looked at her. I'm not asking you to paint something pretty to match my furniture, Sophia. I'm asking you to show me what you see when you look at my world. The challenge in his voice sent a spark through her chest. Before she could second-guess herself, she grabbed the brush and loaded it with deep crimson paint. Fine, she said, but don't blame me if you don't like what you get. The first stroke was angry, a slash of red across the white canvas that seemed to vibrate with tension. Adrian stepped back, giving her room to work, but she could feel him watching every movement. Tell me about the buildings, she said as she added more color. Building layers of paint that seemed to pulse with life. What do you want to know? Who lives in them? What are they running from? She didn't look at him, focused instead on the emerging image. Something that was part architecture, part emotion. Because people who pay that much for warehouse authenticity are usually running from something. There was a long pause. What makes you think they're running? Because authentic people don't need to buy authenticity, Sophia said, adding a streak of gold that caught the light like hope. They create it. She worked for 2 hours, lost in the rhythm of creation, barely aware that Adrian had settled into a chair across the room. The painting that emerged was raw, powerful. A building that seemed to be growing from the earth like something organic, beautiful but somehow lonely against an electric sky. When she finally stepped back, she was breathing hard, her shirt damp with perspiration, and her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of creation. "It's not finished," she said, suddenly self-conscious. "I just got started." Adrian stood slowly and moved to stand beside her, studying the canvas with an expression she couldn't read. "It's remarkable," he said finally, his voice quiet. "But also threatening," she supplied. "Uncomfortable? Too honest? Perfect." He turned to look at her, and something in his eyes made her breath catch. "It's exactly what I was hoping for." "Really?" Sophia couldn't hide her surprise. "It's not exactly what I'd call commercial art." "I don't want commercial art. I want art that makes people feel something, even if what they feel isn't entirely comfortable." He was standing close enough that she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. "I want art that stays with them long after they've left the room." The intensity in his voice made her suddenly aware of how intimate this felt. Standing together in her paint-scented studio, both of them focused on something she'd created. It was like he'd watched her undress after all. "Why?" she asked. "Why is that important to you?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "Because comfortable art is forgettable, and I've never wanted to be forgettable." There was something vulnerable in that admission, a crack in the billionaire armor that made her see him differently, not just as a wealthy collector or a business opportunity, but as a person who understood the terror of insignificance. "The next piece," she said, surprised by her own boldness, "I want to paint you." Adrian went very still. "That wasn't part of our agreement." "It's not for the development. It's for me." She moved to clean her brushes, needing something to do with her hands, to understand what I'm working with. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Afraid of what I might see?" The words were out before she could stop them, teasing and challenging in a way that felt dangerous. When she looked back at him, his expression had shifted, become more predatory, more intense. "You should be careful, Sophia," he said, his voice low enough to raise goosebumps along her arms. "I'm not one of your harmless artist friends. Push me too far, and you might not like what happens." Instead of frightening her, his words sent heat spiraling through her chest. "Is that a threat or a promise?" The question hung in the air between them, charged with possibility and peril. Adrian stared at her for a long moment, something dark and hungry flickering in his eyes. Then he stepped back, the moment broken. "I'll see you tomorrow," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Same time." After he left, Sophia sank onto her stool, her hands still trembling, though whether from the intensity of painting or from the way Adrian had looked at her, she couldn't say. She'd wanted to understand what she was working with. Now she was beginning to realize that Adrian Blackwood was far more dangerous than she'd initially thought. Not because he was ruthless or powerful, but because he made her want things she couldn't afford to want. And judging by the way he'd looked at her before he left, the feeling might be mutual. Chapter 4. Dangerous Ground. The second painting session started differently. Adrian arrived exactly on time, carrying coffee from the expensive place down the street. One for him, one for her, perfectly prepared the way she liked it. "How did you know I take oat milk?" Sophia asked, accepting the cup with suspicious gratitude. "I pay attention," he said simply, settling into what she was already thinking of as his chair. She'd spent the previous evening trying to talk herself out of the portrait idea. It was presumptuous, unprofessional, and definitely not covered by their contract. But when she looked at the fresh canvas she'd prepared, her fingers itched to capture the contradictions she saw in him, the polished exterior hiding something much more complex underneath. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," she began, loading her brush with paint. "About not wanting to be forgettable. Have you?" His voice was carefully neutral. "It's an interesting fear for someone who's built an empire." She started with broad strokes, blocking in basic shapes and shadows. "Most people would think you've already achieved immortality through success. Most people confuse fame with significance." Sophia glanced at him, noting the way his jaw had tightened slightly. "And what's the difference? Fame fades, markets crash, empires crumble." He was watching her work with the same intensity she'd come to expect, but there was something else there now. A wariness, like he was regretting this conversation. "But art endures. It outlasts the person who created it and the person who inspired it. Is that what this is about?" The painting was taking shape now. Not a literal portrait, but something more impressionistic, catching the way light and shadow played across his features. "You want to be immortalized in paint?" "I want to be understood," he said, the words coming out harder than she expected. "And I want to understand." "Understand what?" "You." His gaze shifted from the canvas to her face. "How you do it. How you take pain and transform it into something beautiful." Sophia's brush stilled. "What makes you think my art comes from pain?" "Because all the best art does." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "And because I recognize the look. I see it in the mirror every morning." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. This wasn't the polished billionaire from magazine covers or the smooth negotiator from dinner. This was someone raw and real, and far more dangerous because of it. "What pain?" she asked softly, adding delicate touches to capture the storm gray of his eyes. Adrian was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Have you ever built something beautiful only to watch it destroyed by people who couldn't see its value?" Sophia's heart clenched. "Every day. It's called being an artist." "My mother was an artist," he said suddenly. "Sculptor. She worked in bronze mostly. These incredible pieces that seemed to capture movement even though they were completely still. Our house was full of her work when I was young." He paused, and Sophia waited, sensing this was important. "My father thought it was a waste of time, a hobby that was getting out of hand. When they divorced, he made sure she couldn't afford to keep making art. Couldn't afford the studio space, the materials, the time." His hands clenched into fists. She stopped creating. Just stopped. And a part of her died with it. "Adrian," Sophia breathed, her brush forgotten. She remarried a few years later. A practical man who gave her security and stability, and everything my father said was more important than art. But she was never the same. Never alive the way she'd been when she was working. Sophia set down her palette and really looked at him, saw the pain he carried, the guilt and regret and desperate need to make amends for something that wasn't his fault. "That's why you save struggling artists," she said. "That's why this matters to you." "I can't save them all," he said roughly. "But maybe I can save a few. Maybe I can make sure their fire doesn't get snuffed out by people who don't understand the value of what they're creating." The vulnerability in his admission made her chest tight. This wasn't about business or even attraction, though she was increasingly aware of the way her pulse quickened every time he looked at her. This was about something deeper, more fundamental. "What happened to her work?" Sophia asked. "Your mother's sculptures?" "Gone. My father had them destroyed during the divorce proceedings. Said they were taking up too much space in storage." Adrian's voice was flat, emotionless in the way that meant he was feeling too much. 20 years of creation, gone in an afternoon. Sophia moved without thinking, crossing the small distance between them and placing her paint-stained hand over his clenched fist. The contact sent electricity shooting up her arm, but she didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," she said. "That's unforgivable." Adrian stared down at their joined hands, his breathing slightly uneven. "She always said that art was the closest thing to magic humans could achieve. The ability to take raw materials and transform them into something that could make people feel." "She was right," Sophia said softly. When I saw your work that first day," he continued, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture that made her shiver. "It reminded me of hers. Not the style, that was completely different, but the emotion. The way it seemed alive." Sophia felt tears prick at her eyes. "That's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said about my art." Adrian looked up at her then, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. They were sitting close now, her hand still covering his, the air between them charged with something that had nothing to do with business partnerships or artistic collaboration. "Sophia," he said, her name rough on his lips. "This is a bad idea," she whispered, but she didn't move away. "Probably," he agreed, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "You called me a beautiful mistake once. Maybe this is what you meant." Before she could ask when, she'd said that because she was sure she'd never spoken. Those words aloud, Adrian kissed her. The kiss was everything she'd imagined and nothing like. She'd expected. Gentle at first, questioning, giving her time to pull away. But when she didn't, when she melted into him instead, it deepened, became demanding, desperate. She could taste coffee on his lips and something darker, more complex. Could feel the barely leashed power in the way his hands framed her face, the careful control that suggested he was holding himself back. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sophia realized she was in serious trouble. "This complicates things," she managed. "Everything worthwhile is complicated," Adrian replied, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "The question is whether you're brave enough to handle the complications." Looking into his storm-gray eyes, seeing the challenge and the vulnerability and the hunger there, Sophia realized that her answer scared her more than anything else that had happened since he'd walked into her studio. "Yes," she whispered. "I think I am." Adrian's smile was slow, predatory, and absolutely devastating. "Good," he said, "because I'm about to make things much more complicated." Chapter 5: The Beautiful Mistake. The next few days passed in a haze of creative intensity and sexual tension so thick Sophia could barely breathe. Adrian came to the studio every morning, bringing coffee and pastries from increasingly expensive places, settling into his chair to watch her work with the same focus he probably brought to million-dollar business deals. But everything had changed since the kiss. There was a new awareness between them, a charge that made every casual touch feel deliberate, every shared glance feel weighted with possibility. Sophia found herself hyper-aware of everything about him, the way he rolled up his sleeves when he was thinking, the sound of his quiet breathing, the rare genuine smiles that transformed his entire face. She was in dangerous territory, and she knew it. "You're distracted today," Adrian observed, as she stood staring at a half-finished canvas, brush loaded with paint, but unmoving. "I'm thinking," she said, which was true. She'd been thinking about how his hands had felt against her skin, about the sound he'd made when she'd kissed him back, about how easy it would be to fall for someone who understood the soul-deep need to create. About what? Sophia glanced at him, noting the way the morning light caught the silver in his hair, the sharp line of his jaw. About how this is supposed to work. This? His voice was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Us. This partnership. She set down her brush, suddenly needing distance between them. "The art is getting better, but I'm losing objectivity. About the work. About you." Adrian stood slowly, his movements predatory and graceful. "And objectivity is important to you?" "It's important to my art," she said, backing up until she hit the edge of her work table. "I can't create honest work if we're what, Sophia?" He kept advancing until she was trapped between his body and the table, close enough that she could see the darker flecks in his gray eyes. "If I'm falling for you," she whispered, the admission tearing out of her like a physical wound. Adrian went very still. "Are you?" Instead of answering, Sophia reached up and touched his face, her paint-stained fingers tracing the line of his cheekbone. "You want to know what I see when I look at you?" His hand settled on her hips, holding her steady. "Tell me." "I see someone who spent so much time building walls that he's forgotten what it feels like to let someone in. I see pain that's been polished into armor, and loneliness disguised as success. Her thumb brushed across his lower lip, and she felt him tremble slightly. I see a man who's afraid that if people see who he really is underneath all that perfection, they'll leave. Sophia. And I see someone beautiful, she continued, her voice getting stronger. Not just physically, though you're definitely that, but beautiful, in the way that broken things can be beautiful when someone takes the time to see past the cracks. Adrian's grip on her hips tightened. Is that what I am to you? A broken thing to fix? No, she said firmly. You're a person, complicated and damaged and absolutely fascinating. And being near you makes me want to create things I never imagined before. What kind of things? His voice was rough, strained. Instead of answering with words, Sophia pulled him down and kissed him, pouring everything she couldn't say into the contact. This time, there was nothing gentle or questioning about it. It was desperate, hungry, full of weeks of building tension, and the terrible knowledge that this was probably a mistake. Adrian responded with a growl that sent heat straight through her core, his hand sliding up to frame her face as he deepened the kiss. She could feel the careful control he'd maintained for weeks finally cracking, could taste the desperation that matched her own. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. This is dangerous, he said, his voice rough with want and warning. I know, Sophia whispered, but I think I'm past caring about safe. Adrian's laugh was dark, self-deprecating. You should care. I'm not good at this, Sophia. Relationships, emotional intimacy, any of it. I destroy beautiful things. It's what I do. Maybe, she said, her hands fisting in his shirt. Or maybe you've just never found something worth not destroying. The hope in her voice seemed to undo something in him. With a sound that was half curse, half prayer, Adrian lifted her onto the work table, scattering brushes and paint tubes as he stepped between her legs. You're going to regret this, he warned, his hands tangling in her hair. Probably, she agreed, pulling him closer. But I'd rather regret something I did than something I didn't do. This time when he kissed her, it was with the kind of raw honesty that made her forget why this was complicated. His hands were everywhere, tracing the curve of her waist, the line of her collarbone, the sensitive spot just behind her ear that made her gasp his name. Beautiful, he murmured against her throat, his lips finding the pulse point that had been driving her crazy for weeks. So damn beautiful. Sophia arched into his touch, her hands exploring the hard planes of his chest through his shirt, marveling at the way he shuddered when her fingers found the buttons and began working them free. Here, she asked, suddenly aware of where they were. Her studio, with windows that faced the street and a door that didn't lock. Here, Adrian confirmed, his hands sliding under her shirt to trace patterns on her bare skin that made her forget every objection she might have had. I want you surrounded by your art. Want to make you feel as beautiful as the things you create. The words, spoken with such fierce sincerity, nearly undid her completely. No one had ever made her feel precious before, like something worth cherishing rather than just convenient. Adrian, she breathed, his name a plea and a promise. Tell me to stop, he said, even as his hands continued their maddening exploration. Tell me this is a mistake and I'll walk away. Sophia looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw her own desperation reflected back at her. Saw the man who'd been shaped by loss and disappointment, who'd built an empire but never learned how to build trust, who was offering her his vulnerability like a gift and terrifying himself in the process. It is a mistake, she said, her hands working to push his shirt off his shoulders. A beautiful, terrible mistake. And I want to make it anyway. Adrian's control finally shattered. With a sound that was pure need, he claimed her mouth again, and Sophia lost herself in the sensation of being wanted, not for what she could provide or how she might fit into someone else's plans, but for exactly who she was in this moment. His touch was reverent and demanding, gentle and possessive, everything she hadn't known she was craving. When he whispered her name like a prayer against her skin, when he made her feel like art come to life beneath his hands, she understood why people wrote songs about falling in love with the wrong person, because Adrian Blackwood was definitely the wrong person. Too wealthy, too complicated, too used to getting what he wanted and discarding it when he grew bored. but as he made love to her with a tenderness that contradicted everything she thought she knew about him, Sophia realized that wrong had never felt so perfectly right. Later, as they lay tangled together on the paint-splattered floor of her studio, Adrian's fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, Sophia tried to process what had just happened. "So," she said, her voice slightly hoarse. "That was complicated," Adrian finished, his arm tightening around her. "I was going to say perfect, but complicated works too." She tilted her head to look at him, noting the way his usual walls had crumbled, leaving him looking younger and more vulnerable. "What happens now?" "Now we figure out how to do this without destroying each other," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "And if we can't?" Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his breathing steady against her hair. "Then at least we'll have had this," he said finally. "At least we'll have had something real." Sophia closed her eyes, memorizing the feeling of being held by someone who understood the artist's heart, the constant hunger for creation, the terror of insignificance, the desperate need to leave something beautiful behind. She was falling in love with Adrian Blackwood, and it was going to complicate everything. But as his breathing evened out, and she felt him relax into sleep, she decided that some complications were worth it, even the beautiful, dangerous ones that might break her heart. Chapter 6. The Gallery of Secrets. 3 weeks later, Sophia stood in front of her latest painting, trying to see it through Adrian's eyes. The piece was unlike anything she'd created before, layers of color that seemed to shift and breathe in the light, abstract forms that suggested intimacy without being explicit. It was their story translated into paint and canvas, beautiful and complex and utterly exposing. "It's finished," she said, as Adrian entered the studio with their morning coffee routine that had become as natural as breathing. He stopped behind her, his presence a familiar warmth at her back. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm over the past weeks, mornings in the studio, afternoons when he worked from his laptop in her space, evenings that blended business discussions with increasingly personal conversations and touches that never quite felt casual. "It's remarkable," he said quietly, his hand finding the small of her back. "But also terrifying," she supplied. "Yeah, I know. It's like hanging our relationship on the wall for everyone to see." "Is that what we're calling this? A relationship?" Sophia turned in his arms, noting the careful neutrality in his voice. They'd been dancing around the definition for weeks, both of them afraid to name what was happening between them. "What would you call it?" she asked. Adrian's hands settled on her hips, his thumbs tracing small circles through her paint-stained shirt. "The most important thing in my life," he said, the admission seeming to surprise him as much as it surprised her. Sophia's breath caught. "Adrian, I have something to tell you," he said, his expression growing serious. "The development project. It's not just about luxury condos." Unease prickled at the base of Sophia's neck. "What do you mean?" "I'm creating a foundation for artists who are struggling financially. Studio spaces, grants, mentorship programs. The residential development is just the funding mechanism." He paused, watching her face carefully. "I wanted to tell you sooner, but I needed to make sure it would work first." Sophia stared at him, trying to process what he just said. "You're creating an artist foundation?" "I'm trying to make sure no one else loses their fire the way my mother did," he said simply. "And you're going to be the first recipient, not just a commission artist, a partner. Your studio will be the prototype for what we offer other artists." The magnitude of what he was offering hit her like a physical blow. Financial security, artistic freedom, the chance to help other struggling creators, everything she'd ever dreamed of. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because I wanted you to want me, not what I could give you," Adrian said, his hands tightening on her hips. "I needed to know that this," he gestured between them, "was real before I complicated it with business." Sophia felt tears prick at her eyes. "You think I'm with you because of what you can provide? I think you're an incredibly talented artist who's been struggling to survive. And I think the line between gratitude and affection can get blurred when someone saves you from losing everything you care about." The careful distance in his voice broke something inside her chest. Is that really what you think? That I'm here because I'm grateful? I think, Adrian said slowly, that I've never wanted anything the way I want you. And that terrifies me because I don't trust myself not to destroy it. Sophia cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. Adrian, I didn't fall for your money or your connections or your ability to solve my problems. I fell for the man who understood why I needed to keep creating even when it made no financial sense. I fell for someone who sees art as magic and treats artists like their dreams matter. Sophia, I fell for you, she said firmly. The real you. Not the billionaire, not the savior, just you. Adrian's kiss was desperate, full of relief and something deeper. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. There's something else, he said. The Foundation's launch event is tomorrow night. A gallery featuring your work alongside pieces from other artists we're hoping to support. I wanted it to be a surprise, but after what just happened... Tomorrow night? Sophia's mind raced. Adrian, I'm not ready for something like that. Gallery showings, investors, press, you're more ready than you know, he said. But if you're not comfortable... No, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. No, I want to do it. I want to be part of what you're building. Adrian's smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. Then we have a lot of work to do. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of activity. Adrian's team descended on the gallery space like a hurricane of efficiency. Lighting specialists, curators, caterers, security personnel. Sophia watched in amazement as her paintings were professionally framed and positioned with museum-quality precision. Nervous? Adrian asked as they stood in the gallery an hour before the event, both of them dressed in formal attire that made the evening feel surreal. Sophia smoothed her hands. Down the front of the black cocktail dress Adrian had insisted on buying her. Not because she couldn't dress herself, but because he wanted her to feel as beautiful as he saw her. Terrified, she admitted. What if they hate the work? What if no one understands what I was trying to say? Then they're not your audience, Adrian said simply. Art isn't about pleasing everyone, Sophia. It's about connecting with the people who need to see what you've created. The first guests began arriving. Wealthy collectors, established artists, journalists, and other potential Foundation supporters. Sophia watched from across the room as Adrian worked the crowd with practiced ease, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing toward her paintings. You must be Sophia, a warm voice said behind her. She turned to find an elegant woman in her 60s, silver hair swept into a sophisticated updo. I'm Margaret Winters. I knew Adrian's mother. Sophia's breath caught. You did? Elena was one of my dearest friends, and one of the most talented artists I've ever known, Margaret said, her eyes growing soft with memory. When Adrian told me about you, about what he was creating in her memory, well, I had to see for myself. What did you think of her work? Sophia asked, hungry for any connection to the woman who had shaped Adrian so profoundly. She had the same quality your work has, Margaret said, studying the painting nearest to them. The piece Sophia had created after their first kiss. The ability to capture emotion so honestly that it makes the viewer feel exposed, like you've seen into their soul. That's the most beautiful compliment I've ever received. It's not a compliment, dear. It's a warning. Margaret's voice grew serious. Artists with that kind of gift. We feel everything more intensely, love deeper, hurt more profoundly. It's what makes us able to create such powerful work. But it also makes us vulnerable to people who don't understand the responsibility that comes with being loved by someone like us. Before Sophia could ask what she meant, Margaret was called away by another guest, leaving her with a chill of unease that had nothing to do with the gallery's temperature. As the evening progressed, Sophia found herself overwhelmed by the positive response to her work. Collectors inquired about purchasing pieces, other artists sought her out to discuss technique, and journalists asked thoughtful questions about her inspiration. But through it all, she was acutely aware of Adrian across the room, watching everything with the intensity of a guardian angel. It was nearly midnight when the last guest departed, leaving Sophia and Adrian alone among her paintings. Her feet ached from the heels she wasn't used to wearing, but her heart was soaring with a combination of artistic validation and professional possibility she'd never experienced before. "We did it," she said, turning to find Adrian watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Adrian, the foundation is going to change so many lives." "Your life first," he said, moving closer. That was always the plan. Something in his tone made her pause. "What do you mean?" Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze shifting between her and the paintings surrounding them. "I mean that everything I've built, everything I've planned for the past 6 months, has been about making sure you never have to choose between art and survival again." The words should have filled her with warmth, with gratitude for his thoughtfulness and care. Instead, they made her stomach clench with a familiar dread. 6 months? She asked slowly. "Adrian, you've only known me for 2 months. His expression shifted, became guarded in a way she hadn't seen since their early days together. "I've known about you longer than that." "What does that mean?" Adrian moved to stand in front of one of her earlier pieces, the angry red painting she'd created the day they met. "I told you I had you researched for due diligence. What I didn't tell you was that the research started long before I walked into your studio." Sophia's blood turned cold. "How long before?" "I've been tracking promising artists for the foundation for over a year," he said, still not looking at her. "Your professor at art school, Dr. Martinez, recommended you. Said you were the most naturally gifted student he'd seen in decades, but also the most likely to burn out without support. You've been watching me for a year." The words came out as barely more than a whisper. "Not watching, researching, following your career, your struggles, waiting for the right moment to help." Adrian finally turned to face her, and she could see the desperation in his eyes. "Sophia, this doesn't change anything between us. It changes everything." The words exploded out of her, raw with betrayal and confusion. "Do you even hear yourself? You've been planning my life for months before I even knew you existed. I was trying to help you. You were trying to control me." Sophia backed away from him, suddenly seeing everything differently. The perfect timing of his appearance, the too convenient solution to her problems, the way he'd known exactly what she needed to hear. God, I'm such an idiot. This whole thing, everything between us, it's all been orchestrated, hasn't it? "No," Adrian said sharply, moving toward her. "What's between us is real, Sophia. What I feel for you is real." "How can I believe that?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. "How can I trust anything you've said when you've been manipulating my life from the beginning?" "I haven't been manipulating. You researched me for months, showed up at the exact moment I was most desperate, offered me the perfect solution to all my problems, and then seduced me into thinking it was all some beautiful coincidence." Her laugh was bitter, broken. "Did you plan that too? The part where I fell in love with you?" Adrian's face went pale. "Sophia, please. That's what this has all been about, isn't it? The damaged billionaire saving the struggling artist. The perfect fairy tale for your foundation's publicity campaign." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup. "Did you practice that story about your mother, or was it at least true?" "Everything I told you about my mother was true," Adrian said, his voice rough with emotion. "And everything I feel for you is true. Yes, I researched you. Yes, I planned the foundation around helping artists like you. But what happened between us? That was never part of any plan." "I don't believe you," Sophia said, the words cutting through her own heart. "I can't believe you. Because if you really cared about me, you would have told me the truth from the beginning." She turned toward the door, needing to escape before she completely fell apart in front of him. "Where are you going?" Adrian called after her. "Home," she said without turning back. "To figure out what parts of my life are actually mine and what parts you've been pulling the strings on." "Sophia, wait." But she was already gone, leaving Adrian alone among the paintings that told the story of their relationship. Beautiful, complex, and now tainted with the knowledge that it had all been built on a lie. Chapter 7. Fractures in the Foundation. Sophia didn't sleep that night. She sat in her apartment, the same tiny space she'd been so desperate to escape, just 2 months ago, staring at the city lights and trying to untangle truth from manipulation in every memory of Adrian, the way he'd appeared at exactly the right moment, the way he'd known exactly what to say to convince her to trust him, the perfect timing of everything, from his interest in her work, to the foundation announcement, to his carefully crafted vulnerability about his mother. Had any of it been real? Her phone buzzed constantly, calls and texts from Adrian that she ignored. She couldn't bear to hear his voice right now. Couldn't risk being swayed by more carefully chosen words designed to make her feel special and wanted. At dawn, she made coffee with shaking hands and tried to figure out what to do next. The foundation was real. She'd seen the legal documents, met the other potential recipients. Her studio was safe, her financial problems solved, her artistic career launched in a way she'd never imagined possible. But it all felt poisoned now, tainted by the knowledge that she'd been a project rather than a partner. A soft knock at her door made her freeze. She knew without looking that it would be Adrian. He was persistent when he wanted something, and apparently he'd wanted her for much longer than she'd known. "Sophia, please." His voice came through the door, rough with exhaustion. "Just let me explain." "There's nothing to explain," she called back, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "You've been planning my life for months. What else is there to know? That I never planned to fall in love with you." The words hit her like a physical blow, making her sink onto her couch with a shaky breath. "That every moment we've shared has been the most real thing in my life," Adrian continued, his voice muffled by the door between them. "That I was going to tell you everything after the gallery showing. I wanted you to see what the foundation could accomplish first. Wanted you to feel confident in your own success before I complicated things with the truth." Despite herself, Sophia found herself moving toward the door. "So you decided to lie to me instead?" "I decided to protect what we had until I was sure it was strong enough to survive the truth." Sophia pressed her forehead against the door, her heart breaking all over again. "Don't you see how twisted that is? You made that choice for both of us. You decided what I could handle and when I could handle it." There was a long pause. "You're right," Adrian said finally. "I did, and I'm sorry." The simple acknowledgement of wrongdoing, without excuses or justifications, caught her off guard. She'd expected him to argue, to try to convince her that his actions had been justified. "I'm sorry too," she said softly, "for the things I said last night. About your mother, about the foundation being a publicity stunt. I was hurt and angry, but that doesn't excuse—" "You had every right to be hurt and angry," Adrian interrupted. "I betrayed your trust in the worst possible way." Sophia closed her eyes, leaning against the door. Part of her wanted to open it, to see his face and maybe find a way to move past this. But the larger part, the part that had been burned by people who claimed to love her while trying to reshape her into something more convenient, knew that trust, once broken, was almost impossible to rebuild. "I need time," she said, "to think, to figure out what I want to do next." "Take all the time you need," Adrian said. "But Sophia, the foundation isn't contingent on what happens between us. Your studio is yours regardless. The opportunities we've created for you, they're not conditional on your feelings for me." "That almost makes it worse," she whispered, "because now I'll never know if anything I achieve is because of my own talent or because of your intervention." She heard him make a sound like a wounded animal, and her heart clenched in response. "Your talent is what made me notice you in the first place," he said. "Everything else, everything we've built together, that's just giving your talent the platform it deserves." "Goodbye, Adrian," Sophia said, moving away from the door before she could weaken and let him in. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls and decisions. Gallery owners who'd seen her work at the foundation event reached out with exhibition opportunities. Collectors inquired about commissioning pieces. Art magazines wanted to feature her as an up-and-coming artist to watch. All of it felt hollow without Adrian there to share it with. Sophia threw herself into painting, creating angry, jagged pieces that reflected her emotional turmoil. But even in her fury and heartbreak, she found herself thinking about what he'd said about his mother, about the foundation, about his desperate need to save artists whose fire was in danger of being extinguished. If his story was true, and Margaret Winters seemed to confirm that it was, then Adrian's motivations, however misguided, came from a place of genuine care. He'd lost his mother to a system that didn't value art, and he was trying to make sure no one else suffered the same fate. It didn't excuse the lies, but it made them understandable. On the 4th day after the gallery showing, Dr. Martinez called. Sophia, my dear. Her former professor's warm voice filled her tiny apartment. I heard about the foundation event. I'm so proud of what you've accomplished. Thank you, Sophia said, curled up on her couch with a cup of tea and another sleepless night behind her. Though I'm not sure how much of it is actually my accomplishment. What do you mean? Sophia found herself telling him everything about Adrian's year-long research, about feeling manipulated and controlled, about not knowing what was real anymore. Dr. Martinez listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of understanding. You know, he said when she finished, I remember the conversation I had with Adrian's people last year. They weren't looking for a charity case, Sophia. They were looking for exceptional talent that was being overlooked by the traditional art establishment. But he targeted me specifically. He targeted your work, Dr. Martinez corrected gently, because I told them you were the most gifted student I'd seen in 30 years of teaching. Because your senior thesis project made me cry, and I'm not a man who cries easily. Sophia was quiet, processing his words. I've known many wealthy collectors in my career, Dr. Martinez continued. Some of them are genuinely passionate about art, but most are simply buying status symbols. The questions Adrian's team asked, the level of research they did into your background and artistic development, that wasn't someone looking for a tax write-off, my dear. That was someone who understood the soul of an artist. But he lied to me, Sophia said, her voice small. Yes, he did. And that was wrong. Dr. Martinez paused. But perhaps the question isn't whether he lied, but why. Was it to manipulate you, or to protect something he valued too much to risk losing? After the call ended, Sophia sat in her apartment thinking about love and trust, about mistakes and forgiveness, about the difference between being controlled and being cared for. Her phone buzzed with another text from Adrian. I know you need space. I just want you to know that I'm not giving up on us. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems hopeless. The message was an echo of her own words from months ago, when he'd asked why she stayed in New York despite her struggles. Because some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems hopeless. Maybe, Sophia thought as she stared at his message, it was time to figure out if what they'd built together was one of those things. Chapter 8. The Art of Forgiveness. A week after the gallery showing, Sophia found herself standing outside the Blackwood Industries building at 7 a.m, clutching a canvas that was still tacky with wet paint. She'd worked on it all night, pouring everything she couldn't say into brush strokes and color choices. The security guard looked skeptical when she asked to see Adrian, but a quick phone call upstairs changed his expression to one of professional courtesy. Mr. Blackwood will see you immediately, he said, gesturing toward the elevator bank. Sophia's hands were shaking as the elevator climbed toward the 52nd floor. She'd rehearsed what she wanted to say, but seeing Adrian again was going to complicate everything. It always did. The elevator opened directly into his office, a space of glass and steel and expensive. Furniture that should have felt cold, but somehow didn't. Maybe because she could see touches of the man she'd come to know. Books on art history, a small bronze sculpture that might have been his mother's work, a photo of them together at the gallery, showing tucked discreetly behind his computer monitor. Adrian was standing at the window wall, looking out over the city. He turned when the elevator chimed, and Sophia's breath caught at the sight of him. He looked exhausted, hollow-eyed, like he hadn't slept any more than she had over the past week. Sophia, he said, her name rough with surprise and hope, and something that might have been relief. I brought you something, she said, holding up the canvas. A commission, from an artist you've been supporting. Adrian moved closer, his eyes taking in the paint stains on her clothes, the evidence of her sleepless night written in the shadows under her eyes. What is it? He asked, nodding toward the painting. It's called Beautiful Mistakes, she said, turning the canvas so he could see it. The painting was unlike anything she'd created before. Layers of translucent color that seemed to shift and flow like water, with darker underlayers that hinted at pain and struggle, without overwhelming the overall sense of hope. At the center was an abstract form that might have been two figures dancing or embracing, or simply existing in the same space. It's about second chances, Sophia said, her voice barely above a whisper. About how sometimes the things that seem like the biggest mistakes can turn into the most beautiful parts of our lives. Adrian stared at the painting for a long moment, then looked at her with an expression that made her heart race. "Does this mean you forgive me?" he asked. "It means I understand," Sophia said carefully. "I understand why you did what you did, even if I don't agree with how you did it. I understand that you were trying to protect something precious, even if your methods were misguided. And us?" His voice was carefully controlled, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the hope he was trying not to show. "Is there still an us to protect?" Instead of answering immediately, Sophia moved to his desk and set the painting down, leaning it against the wall where the morning light would hit it perfectly. "I've been thinking about what Margaret Winters said at the gallery," she said, "about artists feeling everything more intensely, about the responsibility that comes with being loved by someone like us." Adrian nodded, waiting for her to continue. "I think she was warning me about how much it would hurt if I lost you," Sophia said, finally meeting his eyes. "But I think she was also warning me about how much it would cost to keep pushing you away." "Sophia, I love you," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "I love your complicated, protective, slightly obsessive heart. I love that you see art as magic, and that you understand why creating matters more than eating sometimes. I love that you've built an empire, but you still remember what it feels like to lose something irreplaceable." Adrian moved toward her slowly, like he was afraid sudden movement might make her disappear. "I love you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "So much that it terrifies me. So much that I made stupid decisions trying to protect what we had instead of trusting it to be strong enough for the truth." "We're going to need new rules," Sophia said as he reached for her. "Complete honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable." "Agreed," Adrian said, pulling her into his arms. "And I want you to know everything about the foundation, about my plans, about any other research I've done. I want you to be a full partner in all of it." "I want that too," Sophia said, her hands fisting in his shirt. "But I also want you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that if we do this, if we really try to make this work, you'll let me make my own mistakes. You'll let me fail sometimes, struggle sometimes, without trying to swoop in and save me." Adrian's arms tightened around her. "That goes against every protective instinct I have." "I know," she said, pulling back to look at him. "But I need to know that I'm with you because I choose to be, not because you've made yourself indispensable to my survival. You're asking me to watch you hurt when I could prevent it. I'm asking you to trust me to be strong enough to handle my own life," she said firmly. "To trust that what we have is real enough to survive without constant intervention." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "It's going to be the hardest thing I've ever done." "Probably," Sophia agreed. "But I think it's also going to be the most important." "Okay," he said finally. "I promise. No more secret research, no more orchestrated solutions, no more protecting you from truths you have the right to know. And I promise to trust your intentions, even when your execution is questionable," Sophia said with a small smile, "and to remember that being loved by someone doesn't mean being controlled by them." Adrian's smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. "Does this mean I can kiss you now?" "It means you better kiss me now," she said, rising on her toes to meet him halfway. The kiss was everything their first one had been and more, desperate and gentle, passionate and tender, full of the promise of new beginnings and second chances. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. "So what happens now?" he asked. Sophia looked around his office, then at the painting propped against his desk. Their story told in color and light, beautiful and complex and honest, in a way they were only beginning to learn how to be with each other. "Now we figure out how to build something real together," she said. "Something that can survive mistakes and misunderstandings and the occasional bout of well-intentioned stupidity." "Sounds challenging," Adrian said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "All the best art is challenging," Sophia replied. The question is whether you're brave enough to help me create it." Adrian's kiss was his answer, fierce and full of promise and absolutely certain. They had work to do, mistakes to learn from, trust to rebuild. But as they stood together in his office, surrounded by the city he'd conquered and the dreams she'd refused to surrender, Sophia knew they were going to create something extraordinary, something worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed hopeless, something beautiful. Chapter 9. The Foundation's Future. 3 months later, Sophia stood in what had once been her tiny studio, now transformed into the flagship space of the Blackwood Foundation for Emerging Artists. The walls had been knocked down to create an open concept workshop where 6 artists worked at easels, potter's wheels, and drafting tables, their various mediums creating a symphony of creative energy. "It's incredible what you've built here," said James Morrison, the journalist from Art Today who was profiling the foundation for their cover story, and in such a short time. Sophia smiled, watching as Maria, one of their sculpture recipients, worked with a young apprentice on bronze casting techniques. "It wasn't just me. Adrian had the vision and the resources. I just helped translate that into something that would actually serve artists." It had been 3 months of hard work, honest conversations, and slowly rebuilt trust. True to his promise, Adrian had made her a full partner in the foundation, involving her in every decision from space design to recipient selection. They'd moved past the painful revelations of their beginning into something stronger and more authentic than what they'd had before. The foundation now supported 12 artists across various mediums, providing not just studio space but mentorship, business training, and connections to galleries and collectors. It was everything Sophia had dreamed of during her own struggling years, a safety net that didn't compromise artistic integrity. "And your relationship with Mr. Blackwood?" the journalist asked with the kind of carefully casual tone that suggested this was the question he'd really come to ask. "How do you navigate the personal and professional sides of working together?" Sophia glanced toward the glass-walled conference room where Adrian was meeting with potential donors, his presence commanding even through the transparent barriers. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and smiled, the private, genuine smile he saved just for her. "It's complicated," she said honestly. "But the best partnerships usually are. We've learned to separate business discussions from personal ones, to trust each other's expertise in our respective areas, and to remember that we're working toward the same goal even when we disagree on methods." What she didn't tell the journalist was how hard-won that balance had been. The fights over creative control, the moments when Adrian's protective instincts clashed with her need for independence, the careful negotiations required to blend his business acumen with her artistic vision. They'd both had to learn new ways of communicating, of trusting, of loving without trying to control. "The foundation has already received inquiries from other cities," the journalist continued. "Are there plans for expansion?" "That's really a question for Adrian," Sophia said, then caught herself. "Though I should mention that any expansion will prioritize maintaining the personal touch that makes this program work. We're not interested in becoming a factory for artistic production." After the interview concluded, Sophia found Adrian in his temporary office, a converted storage room that he'd insisted was perfectly adequate despite her suggestions that he take the space with the best natural light. "How did it go?" he asked, looking up from a stack of grant applications. "Good, I think." He seemed genuinely interested in the program rather than just looking for gossip. Sophia perched on the edge of his desk, a gesture that had become natural over the past months. He asked about expansion. "And what did you tell him?" "That it's your decision, but that I have opinions about maintaining quality over quantity." She picked up one of the applications, scanning the attached portfolio images. "This one's incredible. The way she captures light." "Rebecca Chen," Adrian said, his voice warm with the pride he always showed when discussing their recipients. "Recent graduate from Arist, working 3 jobs to afford supplies. Her recommendation letters read like love songs." "No relation despite the name," Sophia said with a smile. They'd learned to joke about the early days of their relationship now, the misunderstandings and manipulation that had nearly destroyed them before they'd found their footing. "Speaking of relations," Adrian said, his tone carefully casual. My father wants to meet you. Sophia nearly dropped the application. In all their months together, Adrian had barely mentioned his father except in the context of his mother's divorce. She'd assumed the relationship was non-existent. Your father? Apparently the foundation has been getting enough press that it's come to his attention. He's curious about the woman who convinced me to invest in frivolous artistic pursuits. Adrian's expression was carefully neutral, but Sophia could see the tension in his shoulders. Do you want me to meet him? I want you to do whatever feels right to you, Adrian said, standing and moving to the window. But I should warn you, he's not like us. He doesn't understand why anyone would choose art over security, passion over profit. He's going to see you as either a gold digger or a naive idealist. And which would be worse? Sophia asked, only half joking. With him? Probably the idealist. Adrian turned back to her, his expression serious. He's the kind of man who measures worth in dollars and influence. The foundation, our relationship, your art, to him, it's all just expensive hobbies. Sophia stood and moved to stand beside him at the window, looking out at the Brooklyn street where artists carried portfolios and coffee cups, where creativity and commerce existed in constant tension. Maybe it's time he met someone who disagrees, she said quietly. Adrian's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become their anchor through difficult conversations. You don't have to do this, he said. You don't owe him anything, and you certainly don't need his approval. No, Sophia agreed. But you do. Whether you want to admit it or not, his opinion still matters to you. And if he's going to understand why the foundation is important, why what we're doing here matters, he needs to see it through the eyes of someone who believes in it. He might be cruel, Adrian warned. He was with my mother. Then I'll handle cruel, Sophia said, rising on her toes to kiss him softly. I've been broke, desperate, and dismissed by people who thought they knew better than me. I can handle one disapproving father. The dinner was arranged for the following week at an exclusive restaurant in Manhattan, the kind of place where the prices weren't listed and the waitstaff moved with the quiet efficiency of people who'd been well-trained in handling the wealthy and entitled. Richard Blackwood was exactly what Sophia had expected, tall, distinguished, with the kind of silver-haired authority that came from decades of making decisions and having them obeyed without question. His handshake was firm, his smile polite but cold, and his eyes assessed her with the clinical precision of someone determining her worth. Miss Chen, he said as they were seated, Adrian tells me you're an artist. I am, Sophia replied, accepting the wine menu with a thanks she didn't feel. And you're in real estate development. Among other things, his tone suggested that those other things were far more important and profitable. I understand you've convinced my son to invest significant resources in supporting creative endeavors. Actually, the foundation was Adrian's idea, Sophia said, noting the way Adrian's jaw tightened at his father's phrasing. I just helped him understand how to make it effective for the artists we serve. And how exactly does one measure effectiveness in such subjective pursuits? There it was, the dismissive tone she'd been expecting, the casual cruelty disguised as reasonable inquiry. Sophia had met men like Richard Blackwood before, people who saw art as decoration and artists as children playing with expensive toys. The same way you'd measure effectiveness in any investment, she said calmly. Return on investment, sustainable growth, impact on the target demographic. The difference is that our returns aren't just measured in dollars. Oh? And how are they measured? Sophia pulled out her phone and showed him a photo from the previous week's workshop. Maria Santos, one of our sculpture recipients, just had her first gallery showing. She sold 3 pieces and received commissions for 2 more. She's now able to support herself entirely through her art. She swiped to the next image. David Kim, ceramic artist, was working in a restaurant to pay rent on a studio he could barely afford. Now he's teaching workshops and developing a line for a boutique home goods company. Anecdotal success stories, Richard said, but his attention was focused on the phone screen. What about scalability? Long-term sustainability? We're tracking career progression for all our recipients over a 5-year period, Adrian interjected, his voice carefully professional. Employment rates, income levels, artistic output, community engagement. The preliminary data shows significant improvement across all metrics. And the cost per success story? Sophia felt her temper flare, but before she could speak, Adrian answered. Less than the cost of a single one of your development projects, he said evenly, and with the potential for exponential cultural impact that extends far beyond the immediate financial return. The conversation continued through dinner, Richard probing and challenging every aspect of the Foundation's mission and structure. But gradually, Sophia began to see something else in his questions, not just dismissal, but genuine curiosity. He was a businessman first, but he wasn't stupid, and the numbers Adrian presented were compelling even to someone who didn't care about art. You know, Richard said as dessert was served, his tone slightly less combative than it had been. Your mother used to talk about art the way you're talking about this foundation. Like it was essential to human existence rather than simply decorative. Adrian went very still. You remember that? I remember everything about your mother, Richard said quietly, including the fact that I was wrong to dismiss something that mattered so much to her. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with years of regret and missed opportunities. The Foundation, Richard continued, looking directly at Sophia. It's not just about supporting artists, is it? It's about preserving something that gets lost when people are forced to choose between passion and survival. Yes, Sophia said, her voice soft with surprise at his understanding. Exactly, Richard nodded slowly. Elena would have loved this, would have been proud of what you've built. He paused, then looked at his son. I may not understand art, but I understand legacy. And this is a legacy worth building. Later, as they stood outside the restaurant waiting for their respective cars, Richard shook Sophia's hand with something approaching warmth. Take care of him, he said, nodding toward Adrian. He has his mother's heart. It's a gift, but it's also a vulnerability. I will, Sophia promised. And Miss Chen, if you ever need an investor for expansion, I hope you'll consider me. It would be a way to honor Elena's memory. After Richard's car pulled away, Sophia and Adrian stood on the sidewalk in comfortable silence, processing the evening's unexpected developments. That went better than I expected, Adrian said finally. He loves you, Sophia said. He just doesn't always know how to show it. He loved her too, Adrian said quietly. My mother, but he thought love meant protecting her from the things that might hurt her, even if those things were what made her who she was. Sophia took his hand, understanding the parallel he was drawing. We're not going to make that mistake. No, Adrian agreed, bringing her hand to his lips. We're going to make entirely different mistakes. Better mistakes, Sophia said with a smile. Beautiful mistakes, Adrian corrected, and kissed her under the Manhattan streetlights, surrounded by the city where dreams were made and broken. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, reborn into something stronger than they'd been before. Chapter 10. The Gallery of Hearts. 6 months later, Sophia stood in the same gallery where the foundation had launched, but everything was different now. Tonight wasn't about business or charity or proving anything to anyone. Tonight was personal. You ready for this? Adrian asked, adjusting his tie with the nervous energy she rarely saw from him anymore. Are you? She countered, smoothing her hands down the front of her emerald dress. A color Adrian had said brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes. The gallery was filled with their friends, colleagues, and the extended family they'd built through the foundation, artists whose careers they'd helped launch, donors who'd become genuine supporters rather than just tax write-offs, even Richard, who'd surprised everyone by becoming one of the foundation's most vocal advocates. But tonight wasn't about the foundation. Tonight was about the collection of paintings that lined the walls. 2 years' worth of work that told the story of a relationship built on mistakes and misunderstandings, broken trust and rebuilt love. Ladies and gentlemen, the gallery owner announced, welcome to Beautiful Mistakes, a study in love and art by Sophia Chen. The crowd moved through the space, studying canvases that chronicled everything from their first explosive meeting to quiet Sunday mornings in Adrian's apartment, from their devastating fight to the slow, careful work of rebuilding trust. This one, Margaret Winters said, stopping in front of a piece painted during their worst fight, all jagged lines and harsh contrasts, captures the pain of loving someone who can't trust themselves to be loved. And this one, she continued, moving to a canvas that seemed to glow with internal light, shows what happens when two people finally stop, running from what scares them most. Sophia watched from across the room as Adrian studied the painting she'd never let him see during its creation, the piece she'd worked on in secret for months. It showed two figures in an abstract landscape, their forms intertwining not in a way that suggested one consuming the other, but in a way that suggested mutual support, shared strength. "It's us," he said when she joined him, his voice soft with wonder. "It's who we could be," she corrected. "If we keep choosing each other, keep doing the work." "Sophia?" Adrian said, turning to face her fully, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the gallery despite its quiet tone. The conversations gradually died as people turned toward them. "If I could have your attention for a moment." Sophia's heart began to race as Adrian took her hands, right there in front of everyone they cared about, surrounded by the art that told their story. "2 years ago," he said, his eyes never leaving hers, "I walked into a studio and met an artist who changed my life. I thought I was saving her, but she was the one who saved me." "Adrian," Sophia whispered, aware of the expectant faces surrounding them, but unable to focus on anything, except the man in front of her. "You taught me that love isn't about control or protection or trying to shield someone from the world," he continued. "You taught me that love is about trust, about choosing to build something together, even when that something might be fragile or difficult, or require more courage than you think you have." He dropped to one knee, and Sophia's free hand flew to her mouth as gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Sophia Chen," Adrian said, pulling out a ring that caught the gallery lights like captured starlight. "You called me a beautiful mistake once. Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that some mistakes are worth making?" Through her tears, Sophia looked down at the man who'd orchestrated her rescue, and then learned to let her save herself, who'd built walls around his heart and then trusted her enough to tear them down, who'd loved her with the same intensity he brought to everything else in his life, but had learned to love her with freedom rather than possession. "Yes," she said, her voice strong enough to carry to every corner of the gallery. "Yes, I'll marry you, you beautiful, complicated, impossible man." The ring slid onto her finger like it belonged there, and when Adrian stood and kissed her, the applause and cheers from their friends and family seemed to fade into background music for the perfect moment they'd created together. Later, when the last guest had left, and they were alone among the paintings that told their story, Sophia and Adrian slow danced to music only they could hear. "So," she said, her head on his shoulder, "what happens now?" "Now we keep making beautiful mistakes together," Adrian said, spinning her slowly under the gallery lights. "We expand the foundation to 3 more cities. We plan a wedding that will probably be far too complicated, and we figure out how to love each other for the next 50 years. "Only 50? Sophia teased, looking up at him with eyes bright with joy and possibility. "Well," Adrian said, dipping her dramatically and making her laugh, "I don't want to get ahead of myself. We're still learning how to do this." "True," Sophia agreed as he pulled her back up and into his arms. "But I think we're getting pretty good at it." Around them, the paintings seemed to glow with their own internal light, abstract representations of a love story that had begun with deception and desperation, but had grown into something honest and strong and absolutely unbreakable. They'd both been broken when they met, both convinced they were destined to destroy or be destroyed by love. Instead, they'd learned to create something beautiful from their fractures, to build trust from the ruins of their fears, to love not despite their imperfections, but because of the way those imperfections fit together. As they danced among the art that told their story, Sophia knew that whatever came next, marriage, children, the inevitable challenges that came with building a life together, they would face it the same way they'd faced everything else. Together, with honesty and courage and the absolute certainty that some things were worth fighting for, even the beautiful mistakes, especially the beautiful mistakes. Chapter 11. 5 years later. The morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Brooklyn loft, illuminating canvases that covered nearly every wall. Sophia Chen Blackwood stood at her easel, paint-stained apron over her pajamas, adding final touches to a commission that would hang in the new Blackwood Foundation space in Chicago. "Coffee," Adrian said, appearing at her shoulder with a steaming mug prepared exactly the way she liked it, a ritual that had remained constant through 5 years of marriage and everything that came with it. She hummed, accepting the coffee and leaning back against his chest. "How did the call with the Seattle team go?" "Good. The space is perfect, and we've already got applications from 47 artists." Adrian wrapped his arms around her, careful not to interfere with her painting arm. "Maria thinks we should start with 10 recipients and expand from there." Maria Santos, their first sculpture recipient, was now the Foundation's West Coast director, her own success story having become a template for what they hoped to achieve with every artist they supported. "Sounds reasonable," Sophia said, adding a delicate highlight that made the entire painting seem to come alive. "There, finished." She stepped back to examine the piece, an abstract cityscape that managed to capture both the energy of urban life and the quiet spaces where art happened. It was sophisticated, confident work, the kind that galleries fought over and collectors waited lists to acquire. "It's magnificent," Adrian said, and she could hear the pride in his voice that still made her heart flutter after all these years. "Thank you. Though I should point out that your opinion might be slightly biased." "My opinion is extremely biased," Adrian agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "But it's also correct." Sophia turned in his arms, noting the way the morning light brought out the silver that was beginning to thread through his dark hair. He was 38 now, more distinguished than he'd been when they met, but the intensity in his gray eyes hadn't changed. "The doctor called yesterday," she said, her tone casual but her heart racing. Adrian went very still. And, Sophia smiled, watching as understanding dawned in his expression. "We're going to need to convert the guest room into a nursery." Adrian's face cycled through surprise, joy, and something that looked like terror before settling on wonder. "Really?" he asked, his hands moving to cup her face. "We're really, Sophia confirmed, laughing as he spun her around the studio, both of them careful to avoid the wet canvases and paint supplies. When he set her down, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "A baby," he said like he was trying out the words. "Our baby. Terrifying, isn't it?" Sophia said, but her smile was radiant. "Absolutely terrifying," Adrian agreed, "and absolutely perfect." They stood together in their sun-filled studio, surrounded by 5 years' worth of art and love, and the beautiful mistakes that had shaped their life together. Soon they would be 3 instead of 2, and everything would change again. But they'd learned how to handle change, how to trust each other through uncertainty, how to build something lasting from the most unlikely beginning. "What do you think?" Sophia asked, looking around the space that had been the foundation of their relationship. "Ready for another beautiful mistake?" Adrian's kiss was his answer, fierce and tender and full of the promise that no matter what came next, they would face it the way they faced everything else. Together.